What's up, average dudes? Matt Mormon here with the ADP Averages podcast, and we're just going to answer some questions here. I went onto Reddit, went to the Fantasy Football tab, and just kind of looked around a little bit at some of the top trending subjects from this last week, and figured this would be a good chance for me to give my thoughts on some of those here, as just some things the fantasy football community as a whole are talking about. This first one from St. Freud 98 says, "How should we be valuing popular undersized wide receivers? Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Josh Downs, Demario Douglas don't clear 6 foot, not exceptional wingspans, fast, but mainly rely on perfect route running and consistently early separation. Guys who are good but not quite built like Cheetah physically, / not the same type of wide receiver. These are examples that come to mind who are currently have some steam, and some more steam than others, all undervalued at a second or more in most leagues, regardless of format. That's for Dynasty, of course. I feel like we're uncharacteristically large guys who fit this description are gaining Dynasty favor this year. If you feel relatively unbiased by the players named above and have seen a lot of these guys come and go, have a lot of Dynasty and NFL viewing experience, or if you don't, but especially if you do, how often do they really pan out in the NFL? Do you think public perception of these guys is currently inflated or just about right? Is it possible the wide receiver archetype is changing a little bit, or is it just an unusual class?" So that's two things at the very end I definitely want to hit on first here. Number one, very unusual class. Go back to what me and Tanner were talking about last year around this time with the rookie draft of last season. Most of these receivers were not that big. And outside of Quentin Johnston, I don't think there was another wide receiver taken in the first few rounds where size was a positive, right? Where it was a big receiver, right? I'm trying to think. I think Xavier Hutchinson had some size to him a little bit further down the board as a bit of a, an X style receiver, but most of them are smaller guys. Like you just listed, Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Josh Downs in particular. Demario Douglas was kind of totally off everybody's radar. He was a great find late. But for those other guys, it was small archetypes for those wide receivers. That was just kind of a thing with last year's class. Even Jack Smith and Jigba and Jordan Addison, not real big receivers, right? They're not small, but they by no means are large. The other thing, though, he mentions is the archetype of wide receiver potentially changing. I think it is to an extent. I think we're not going to come in here 4 years from now and say, wow, wide receivers are just all these little bitty guys. But I also think we're going to see more and more value for that archetype of wide receiver, right? I think back to kind of the past, and I looked at one of the draft classes. I think it was 2019, I think it was. You had Andy Isabella and Mecole Hardman, both in that class. And neither guy really got their footing underneath of them. Both of them, especially Isabella, very fast receiver. I do think about Rondale Moore a handful of years ago as well, as kind of being in that same mold, very small guy. And they were kind of used as just gadget guys, right? Like, think about what Mecole Hardman really has been. The occasional deep shots, but mostly it's kind of in the fun underneath, screen games, jet sweeps, that kind of stuff. Those kinds of plays are becoming more and more prevalent in the NFL today. And so I think it's giving a lot more value to those styles of players. I think about some of the ones who have succeeded while being a bit undersized, and a lot of them are more of those route running types, right? I think Zay Flowers definitely fits that mold. Jaden Reed as well. I think that really is a skill that you need, either that or elite speed, right? In the question, he mentioned Tyreek Hill, and of course, that's mega elite speed. That just isn't fair to expect that of anybody else. But Tank Dell, also a very fast receiver. And then you have a guy like a Demario Douglas and a Josh Downs, who I think are pretty good route runners. I think they're decently fast, but not excelling at either. And they're having success. Josh Downs is actually a player who I really am excited about for 2024 as a guy. And so I do think the league has changed a little bit. I think smaller players at every position are becoming more and more viable. And it's not necessarily a thing of, I guess I don't think we're going to see a bunch of high-end guys with that, but I do think we're going to see where there are more options and more of that middle class. Size doesn't matter as much. Those guys can thrive. They can have that opportunity. However, I do think you need to have mega elite speed when you're that size in order to be a top 5, top 10 kind of guy. This one comes from How Did He Not Do It? CMC ranked first in rushing yards with 1459. No other running back even broke 1,200. first in rushes for first downs, first in rushing yards over expected, first in total scrimmage yards, second in rushing touchdowns, and second in yards per touch among 2023 running backs. Should he be undisputed number one overall again in 2024? Yes, he probably should be. I do think injury risk is a pretty big factor with Christian McCaffery, which sounds funny because then I'm going to recommend wide receivers. And we just saw Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase go down with injuries this past season. So it's kind of a pretty thin argument to make if you just look at last year. But if you look kind of overall, big picture wise, wide receivers tend to not get hurt as much as running backs, especially running backs who have had that kind of a workload. I do want to stress that absolutely as a thing. He's coming off back-to-back years of 300 plus touches. The previous time McCaffrey had that kind of workload back-to-back years, he basically spent the next 2 years injured, right? So I do think that that's a concern for sure with the injuries. It's rarely a good bet to bet on a 28-year-old running back. Just look at, Austin Eckler a year ago, right? Same age basically as McCaffrey is, totally fell face of the earth. And really, if you want to blame on the ankle injury or not, that age is going to make that ankle injury hurt a little bit longer, a little bit harder, and can really kind of zap that explosiveness away from you more so than it could potentially a younger player. I do think that Elijah Mitchell needs to be a priority handcuff. Whether you draft Christian McCaffrey or not, I would really be trying to target him a little bit earlier than maybe in the past with the higher end handcuffs, because I think that he would be great if something were to happen on Christian McCaffrey. However, you cannot play scared though, and when it comes to Christian McCaffrey, I believe I saw about 50%, I think it was on ESPN leagues of championships had Christian McCaffrey in them. And so it's just an undeniable upside, whether it be PPR, non-PPR, points for first downs, half PPR, whatever scoring you've run, Christian McCaffrey is probably the most valuable player in that format. Super flex, maybe it's quarterbacks. But other than that, Christian McCaffrey is absolutely, when he's clicking, when he's firing all cylinders, he's the number one player. This one, a little bit less of a question, a little bit more of a statement that I just kind of wanted to highlight here. From Green Definition 5, Tony Pollard said he finally felt back from his broken leg injury versus the Panthers in Week 11. And Pro Football Focus's highest graded rusher from Week 11 onward was indeed Tony Pollard. I think this is interesting. There's no question here that, I think people are definitely kind of discounting Tony Pollard at the moment. He is going into free agency, so of course we need to see where he lands. Personally, I put in a video just the other day, I would like to see him go somewhere where he is kind of sharing a little bit more. I don't want to see him have a massive workload. And part of that is just, the body style being able to hold up, right? I do think that he's a real sleeper potential, though, for next year. We need to see where he lands. That's the first thing, first and foremost here, right? We need to see where Tony Pollard's playing football in 2024. But he's definitely a guy who I'm kind of excited about, I think. And seeing this stat come across my dashboard got me very, very excited as well. And that, when he said he felt back, the results then showed. And it was at a time, too, where I think a lot of people are no longer paying attention to Tony Pollard. Really, think back Week 11. It was kind of the Dak and CeeDee Lamb show in Dallas. Also, if you drafted Tony Pollard, you probably were either out of it or traded him away at that point, because he was one of the biggest busts in fantasy last year, without question. And coming back from injury is going to be part of that. But people took the risk on him, drafted him in the first couple rounds, and just didn't hit. And so it takes a lot of time to come back from those kinds of massive injuries. And that actually leads us right into our next question about Breece Hall and players coming off torn ACL. So this one comes from Detroit 5G, players coming off an ACL injury. Every year near fantasy draft season, I see people posting that players coming off an ACL are essentially off their draft board and not worth their ADP risk. Breece Hall tore his ACL the year prior, ended up being a top 5/10 running back, depending on scoring format, despite not having a great offensive line and defenses stacking the box. To anyone who usually avoids these players, does what Breece Hall did this past season make you reconsider players coming off an ACL tear and or any other season-ending injury? So, no, he did not really change my opinion about it. I'm not one to take them completely off my board. I think that there are times and different factors to consider, right? The timing of the injury. Earlier in the football season means they should be able to potentially be back earlier in the following season. Kyler Murray was a player who I was kind of banging the drum for last summer. I thought that with kind of the window of, it was a later season injury, but being a quarterback, I thought would really help out quite a bit. I thought also the Cardinals had a lot of incentive to play him last season, as it was kind of going to be a lost year one way or another. And so give him those reps, right? I think, you can look at Breece Hall and say, look how great he was. He was great for fantasy. You also have to remember instantly, Javonte Williams was not very good. And J.K. Dobbins suffered another injury, but, not necessarily related. But kind of on the other side of that coin. Breece Hall was not a great rusher this year. There was definitely some of that is the offensive line's fault. Some of that is the quarterback play, the offense as a whole, like you mentioned in the question. But I think some of that's on Breece Hall too. There weren't a whole lot of explosive plays out of Breece Hall this year. There were a few, definitely. And you can make a highlight reel that goes for about 2 minutes on Breece Hall, really long touchdown runs. But outside of those 6, he didn't really break any others, And there were 9 games where he had under 3.5 yards per carry. And yards per carry is not everything, but I think it is kind of a good thing to look back on and see how a player played. Not necessarily always good to use moving forward, but you can look back on it, I think, and say, there were signs there that it wasn't great for Breece Hall and that he was struggling. And some of his best games came at the end of last season. Yeah, looking at his game log right now, and 3 of his top rushing games were the final 3 games of the year, right? 95 yards against Washington, 84 against Cleveland, and 178 against New England. He had that great week 1, and that was super encouraging. But then from a rushing standpoint, things fell right off the map quickly. And that definitely hurt him quite a bit. And also, if you look at the middle of the season, there's a big gap there in the middle of the red. I've got his sleeper game log pulled up right here on the video portion of things. And you can see the whole middle portion of this season, there's just nothing going on for him rushing. However, receiving-wise, that's where Breece Hall was mega involved. He was just getting a ton of targets. And that's something that was great for Breece, and it worked, and it made his season awesome this year. Moving forward, though, I don't know if that's something I want to take and contribute to the next player, right? There's Nick Chubb, there's J.K. Dobbins. Nick Chubb, I'm very concerned about. He's an older running back. He doesn't catch passes either. He's never done that in his career. If he sticks in Cleveland, he also has a quarterback who's never thrown to running backs in his career. So for Nick Chubb, as much as it pains me to say, because I do love Nick Chubb, he's been one of my favorite players to watch over the last 6 or so years now. I'm going to probably be out on Nick Chubb. He's going to need to be at a very big discount in order for me to be interested in there. J.K. Dobbins is coming off an Achilles tear, not the same injury, obviously, but he is at least younger, and I think there is some pass catching ability that we just haven't seen yet in Baltimore. He did catch some passes actually back in week 1 of the season before he got hurt, so a small sample size there. He gets the skill he has. And so I think J.K. Dobbins, if he is also going at a very low price tag, he's the one I'm far more willing to consider going forward. TJ Hawkinson, he will probably fall in that category of essentially being off my draft board this year because I think he probably won't even be back on the field until November. That would be my guess there. And so I don't really want to wait that long because then you got to factor in too. Like I said, Breece Hall, that whole middle chunk of the year was not that great from a rushing standpoint for him. He was catching passes. And obviously, TJ Hawkinson only catches passes. So Hawk could get some underneath work there. I just don't expect him to be making plays the way that maybe he did in the past to launch him to superstardom. I think I'm okay taking him in more of the round 8 range, probably. Like, that's kind of the threshold, I think, where I'm usually done taking players that are like, immediately I need contributions, right? And so that's kind of a point where I'm willing to take a chance on a guy like that. I think I'm more willing to take a chance on Hawkinson than I am Dobbins, and Dobbins than I am Chubb for this upcoming year moving forward on players who have these sorts of injuries. So guys, that'll do it for me for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out some other stuff here on the channel. I just did a whole series on each NFL team and their free agency this offseason, what players are going to be leaving those teams potentially, and some opportunities for some players on the rosters. Also, just the other day on Valentine's Day, I played Matchmaker. I was kind of hooking couples up here between some NFL free agents and some NFL teams. So check that one out as well.